Hi everyone, welcome. Um, Thanks for joining me for our little symphony preview today, whether you're watching it live or catching it as a video later. Um, for Vistas, the concert is coming up on Sunday. You'll be able to see it on the KRTV app. That's November 15th at 2 p.m., so I hope you'll check it out then. I know some people are not so awesome at apps and things like that, so if that's you, um, just you can go to your web browser, the KRTV Live. You can find that link on the gfsymphony.org website. So I know that some people have had success also with Amazon Fire Stick too. So I've tested it. I know it works, and I'm sure it will be great. As always, there's sort of a delay between what I say and when you hear it. So I won't ask for questions in real time. But if you do have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat and I'll answer it when I see it. The theme for this concert is sort of warm sunny day music, you might say. We have a few pieces by Percy Grainger, both based on folk songs, both very green in their titles, as well as Copland's Appalachian Spring about frontier life, and even the Haydn Concerto that we'll be doing, and I'll talk about in a bit, even though it's not really outdoorsy, has a very kind of sunny disposition, so I think it fits in well. The kind of weird thing about this particular preview is that, as many of you I hope have heard, we've been instructed that we're no longer allowed to do the live portions of our programs. And that's a bummer, but of course a totally reasonable thing for the powers that be to ask us to do. So this is the first time I am ever doing this preview after doing all of the performances. We did our recordings last weekend in the middle of a blizzard. And so it's sort of a strange thing, like the music is sort of all done. I've put all my scores away, and now I'm here to talk about what you'll be hearing later on. In any case, why don't we start with some Grainger. Percy Grainger, if you're sort of a band geek, is a very familiar name, huge name in the band world. Some of his most famous compositions are either band compositions or compositions that are played mostly by bands. As we'll talk about in a bit, Grainger often did different orchestrations, different instrumentations of his music. So the pieces like Lincolnshire Posy, Molly on the Shore, Shepherd's Hay, things like that get played by bands a lot. But he did, as I say, he wrote tons of music for orchestra as well. And again, preferred this sort of adaptable instrumentation approach. So Grainger is, let's see, he's 1882 to 1961, I believe, is his lifespan. Born in Australia, moved to Germany to study music as a teenager, lived there for a few years, settled in London for a few years before coming to the US at the beginning of World War I. He says he did it because his mother needed a change of pace. Some people decided that he was more likely dodging the draft, but nevertheless, he came to the U.S. in 1914, actually joined an army band playing saxophone, and was more or less based in the U.S. Until his death. He certainly did lots of traveling back to Australia and back to Europe a lot as well. So, but pretty much settled as a kind of permanent address in the United States. He has a reputation for being like a really kind of quirky dude with sort of some stage antic-y kinds of things. He lived with his mother until she died in 1920, until she committed suicide. And they were very close. And according to some people, maybe closer than they should have been. And he also had some kind of weird, not entirely admirable kind of racial theories. You can find some letters where he makes some kind of anti-Semitic remarks. One of the things that was really important to him was Nordic culture. So he was a good friend of Grieg. He met Grieg and respected him greatly, the Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. And he sort of took to this kind of idea of the kind of superiority of Nordic culture to such a degree that it actually affected the way that he spoke English. He preferred to use words that didn't have this sort of Romance language corruption. So if you read his scores, they have these, they look a little silly in the words that he chooses sometimes. So he'd put mezzo forte and then he'd put like somewhat loudly underneath it. He would call violas middle fiddles, things like that. Instead of using sort of conventional Italian things like tempo primo, he would write first speed, that sort of thing. He, again, and if you read his scores, they look a little bit strange in that way. He had a really kind of democratic approach to the music that he wrote. As I say, he preferred to write different orchestrations, several different orchestrations for everything he wrote, kind of with this idea that, you know, he didn't want to be limited by, he didn't want you to be limited by the instrument that you played in order to play his music. So much of his music exists in several different versions. And he also is one of the few composers to sort of put, again, in his scores, these sort of weird notations where he says things like, you know, play it mezzo forte or play it forte, you know, it's up to you, which is something you hardly ever get in most scores. He's also, there's a weird kind of irony to him. If you think about his reputation today as a composer, as I say, it's mostly as a band guy, and it's mostly as an arranger of folk songs. He's actually a very kind of popular kind of composer, someone who writes music that goes down smooth. And that said, he was also one of the, he's sort of ahead of his time in a lot of the kind of experiments with music that he did. He is one of the first composers to work with aleatoric music, music that has elements of randomness and chance, several decades before people like John Cage would make such techniques, I won't say popular, but sort of more well-known. And he also was really interested in sort of musical machines, sort of building new instruments. Probably really would have been into synthesizers had he lived a little bit later. So it's this weird thing where he's very innovative in a lot of ways, but again, he's mostly known for these sort of slightly popular folk song tunes. And speaking of that, he was a huge collector of folk songs. A lot of composers were in the first half of the 20th century, composers like Vaughan Williams and Bartók and things like that. But that was a big deal to him too, not just in Europe, but he also collected a lot of folk songs in like the South Pacific, Polynesia, places like that, and wrote a lot of arrangements of these, adapted them into concert works. So for our program, for Vistas, we're going to be performing two of these works, two of these compositions of his that are actually arrangements of existing songs. One definitely a folk song, one it's a little bit harder to say since its origins are kind of lost to the mists of time. But let's talk about the folk song first. This one that you can see on your screen there, Green Bushes, is a folk song from the British Isles that was first notated in the early 1800s. And it's popular enough to have several different arrangements of it made. Grainger not only did this version that you'll hear now, but he also included it in Lincolnshire Posy, that famous piece of his for band. It also shows up in Vaughan Williams' Folk Song Suite for Band, another piece that bands play a lot. It's a ballad, which means it tells a story, and I've actually got a recording here that we can listen to, some singers telling the story. We'll just hear a couple verses of it. I don't know if this accompaniment comes from some kind of source or not, but you can definitely hear the tune. So here are the Dolly Mops. Let's hear what they do with it.
'Twas down in a valley a fair maid did dwell, where she lived with her uncle as all knew full well. 'Twas down in a valley where violets were gay, she'd been missing and could not be found. Her uncle he searched the country around, till he came to a trustee between hope and fear. But the trustee made answer, she has not been here.
We'll leave it at that. If you want to hear the rest of the story, you'll have to seek it out on your own. Grainger thought of this song as a dance song, and so he said, if you're going to do a dance song, you of course need to repeat it as people are dancing, right? They want to dance for a while. And so in his version, it kind of builds up a lot of energy as the dancers get more and more into it. Specifically, he uses a form which we call a passacaglia, and a passacaglia literally means street step. And it emerges in Spain in the 1600s. And basically the idea is that you're walking down the street and in a crowd, and one of the members of your crowd is playing the guitar or something like that, and they're playing this sort of same pattern over and over again, sort of just to keep the mood going. And as you know, they're repeating this pattern, they might add little flourishes, a little bit of improvisation. They'll make each time they repeat it a little bit different. And so that's what we get with this Grainger piece. It's, as you can see, it's not quite 9 minutes long, and it's the same melody basically repeated over and over again. I think it ends up being about 36 times in total. But each version of the melody is a little bit different. Even if the tune, the person playing the tune in the ensemble is playing roughly the same thing each time, all the other parts that are around it are changing as they go. So you get really high energy rhythmic versions of the tune, you get lyric, melodic, legato versions of the tune, things like that. So the style is kind of constantly changing while this melody is repeating and kind of building to this big conclusion. I'll just start it off. I may stop it at times if I have something intelligent to say, but let's take a listen. Right. I'll stop it there for just a bit. We'll move it ahead. As I say, Grainger used a lot of different orchestrations for his music. I think the orchestra here is using the same one that we used when we recorded, but there are optional parts for saxophones in this piece, for example. You'll also see two different keyboard instruments. There's the piano that started off the piece, but there's also another sort of organ-like instrument called a harmonium, which is basically what you get if you took an accordion and slapped a keyboard on it. You get something like what that instrument is. As I say, I'll nudge it forward just a touch and we'll listen to the end. There's the harmonium. Cool. Thanks, Pam. I tried to nudge the levels a little bit. Hopefully that helps. I can say, as having just conducted it, that you really do feel sort of like that conductor does, where you're just sort of flailing at every bar. That's the kind of thing that can happen when you're conducting a piece like this, which has the same melody kind of happening over and over again. And every measure is in one beat to a bar, so you just feel like you're kind of just beating each measure over the head just a little bit. The next piece, as I said, we're doing two pieces by Grainger, and as you can imagine, the second one is called My Robin is to the Greenwood Gone. This is not a folk song, at least as far as we know. It's a popular song in that it's a song that was popular in sort of Shakespearean times. The first written versions of it that we know about come from the late 1500s, and they come from these lute books. These people trying to sell sheet music and make some money would take songs that people would have known and adapt them into versions that people could play in their homes. For instance, if you had a neighbor who played the lute, for example, And so I've got a friendly lute player here who's going to play this lovely melody for you. Cool. There's that smile. Grainger, as always, I don't have a great video of this version, I'm afraid, but as always, Grainger made several different versions of this song. And I think what's really fascinating about the way he chose to set it is that it shows, again, not just his kind of popular folk song liking side, but also his really adventurous side. So in this version of My Robin is to the Greenwood Gone, you'll hear an intro, and then you'll hear the violin play about 4 measures of the tune, and then the melody just sort of wanders off in its own direction. And there's at no point in this piece that you ever get the full melody. You sort of get those first 4 bars, and then kind of meandering off into the distance, and then those first 4 bars will come back again. And it's this piece that kind of defies understanding just a touch. It's beautiful. There's never an unpleasant moment to it, although there's some crunchy harmonies now and then. But it always feels like it's just sort of out of your grasp just a little bit. And I think that's what makes it an especially lovely version. It's not just sort of taking the melody and giving it to orchestra instruments and being done with it. One other theme to this entire program that I suppose I could have mentioned earlier is that, again, in the interest of being safe in COVID times, is to keep all of our players distant. And so every piece that we're doing is playable by a relatively small group of musicians. The 2 Grainger pieces are all 1 and apart, so we don't have full string sections. And this piece is actually for quite a small orchestration: 1 violin, 2 violas, 2 cellos, bass, flute, and English horn. Again, Grainger, with his weird language use, refused to call that group of 8 musicians an octet. He called it an 8-sum or something like that. But yeah, so 8 musicians on this particular version of My Robin is to the Greenwood Gone. Here's where the melody starts but fails to finish. Here's a little bit more of the melody. We'll hear a little bit more of the melody here. And it's gone. And then to finish it off, we'll bring the introduction back. Yeah, I love that thing. Yeah, Andrea, I think you're right that it's again, it just sort of doesn't quite go where you want it to go sometimes, and I think it's one of its best qualities as a piece. Even at the very end, you get this. You feel like we're finishing off, and you get this glorious E major chord, and everything's done, and everybody's fine. And then suddenly you get these two other chords which aren't E major. It's like, wait, uh, that's not what I expected to happen there, which is again, I think part of its sort of glorious charm. Um, but in any case, it's a sort of beautifully elusive kind of music, which I find very attractive. In any case, we'll step aside for some Grainger now and move on to some Haydn. Uh, Haydn, I believe. Let's see here, dates from 1732 to 1809, I think, and major composer of the classical era of the late 18th century, arguably the most popular composer of his day, this kind of patriarch or the kind of leading figure during that era. He's most famous for the kind of central part of his career, at least in terms of his biography, where he spent a couple of decades working as a court musician for the Esterházys in Hungary. And a lot of people will characterize this as kind of being out in the boonies doing his own thing with nobody noticing. And there's something to that. The Esterhazy court, the actual location of it, was kind of a small town, and I imagine that it felt somewhat isolated. There's a famous quote by Haydn saying that he had to become original because there was sort of no one around to tell him where to go. Um, that, on the other hand, that's a little bit misleading. That court is only nowadays, it's only a couple hours away from Vienna, which is the imperial capital at the time, and a court is still a court. So the empress would come to visit sometimes, and so yeah, Haydn was a known quantity in Vienna, so when the sort of music-loving count, the one who made Haydn churn out reams and reams of music all the time, died. And the seat went to a less music-loving count, and Haydn was sort of more or less released from employment. Haydn was immediately able to get tons of work, tons of commissions outside of the Esterhazy court in Vienna, and again all throughout Europe. So made truckloads of money writing symphonies for public audiences, ticket-buying audiences in London, for example. So again, by the end of his life, Haydn is well established in Vienna and has this kind of stature as the godfather or something like that. The sort of most important musical force in Viennese and to a certain extent in European life, especially outside of the opera world, though he did write operas as well. All that said, one of the consequences of this kind of writing music for rich, important people career is that Haydn was very, very good at what you might call music that's made to order, giving you exactly what you want. And I don't mean that in kind of a slumming way. In fact, you could say his most important, his most valuable skill is to both give you exactly what you want, but do it in an extremely high quality fashion. So, thinking about sort of modern figures that might be similar, I think of someone like Christopher Nolan, for instance, whose movies are both very popular, but critics seem to like them too. Beloved by critics and audiences alike, that kind of approach. One of these things that happens, though, is that you're having to write, again, for very specific purposes for very specific people. So in 1786, the King of Naples says, Haydn, I want you to write some music for me, and I play this instrument called the Lire Organizzate. The Lire Organizzate is an instrument that we think about so rarely that we don't even have a decent English name for it. Literally means the organized lyre, and it's basically what you get if an organ and a hurdy-gurdy have a baby. I have a little video here of a gentleman who plays the instrument a touch, and we can listen to it. I mostly just want to show the thing to you. So the first thing you'll notice is that he's playing it with a crank, and that's the hurdy-gurdy part. So if you don't know what a hurdy-gurdy is, it's basically a violin. So we've got strings, but instead of using a bow, you turn a crank. And that has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that if you're playing a bowed string instrument, eventually you're going to run out of bow and you have to change, so you can't play kind of continuously. With a wheel, you can just turn it continuously forever, and you can theoretically, until your arm gives out, hold a note as long as you want to hold it. What you can't do is all sorts of fun off the string bouncy strokes and things like that. So it's a little bit more limited for its variety. So that's one part of the instrument. The other thing you can kind of see already about here is it's got these sort of organ pipes attached to it. And so you've got both the string instrument half of it going as well as the organ half of it going. And the other thing you can see from this angle is that he's using buttons to play it. And that has the consequence of making it a little bit easier to play than actually a violin, where you don't have sort of guides. They sort of act a little bit like frets in that way on a guitar, where it sort of guides your fingers where they need to go. the end result of this kind of instrument is that it's easy-ish. It's a little bit easier to pick up if you're an amateur. Say if you're the king of Naples and you have better things to do during the day, but at night you want to unwind and play a little music. This is an instrument you can learn pretty easily. And so it works well for this kind of amateur class of musicians. What's great about it, the sort of interesting thing, we don't think about the recording revolution much, but it really was a revolution once recording technology started to happen, for the simple reason that you could now listen to music without having a musician in the same room. And that certainly wasn't the case in Haydn's day. So there was much more of a reason for anybody walking around to want to be an amateur musician. So if you wanted to listen to music, you had to play music, or at least know someone in your immediate circle who did. So an instrument like this would have been helpful for those amateur musicians who couldn't practice all day but still wanted to not just play but listen to music. This would have been one of the few ways to do it. As I say, it's a very sunny piece. Again, what Haydn's one of his great skills is writing music that people would really catch on to quick, amateur musicians as well. He actually wrote 5 concertos for 2 Lire Organizzate, and we'll be doing the first one, the one in C major. Believe it or not, we don't have 2 Lire Organizzate players, so we're going to be covering those 2 parts on flute and oboe with our 2 principal musicians, Norman Manzales and Paul Chinen. And that's a really common way to play these pieces. Not many Lire Organizzate players today. So I don't have a great video for this one, but as you're listening, you'll hear the lyre. It's a little bit hard to hear sometimes, but if you listen to that sort of organ sound in the treble register, that's where you'll hear it. So let's take a listen. That's cool. We'll listen to just a little bit more of it, but you can actually hear the buttons kind of clicking, which is kind of an interesting thing. The other thing, I mentioned that it's a little bit hard to hear the solo instruments. Again, if you're writing a piece for amateurs, you don't want them to feel like they're all alone. So the melodies are often doubled in the other instruments, not always, but there's definitely a lot of support happening when the solo instruments are playing. And that'll end up finishing off the movement for that one. Um, I'd play more, but we should definitely talk Copland. Aaron Copland, definitely a familiar name if you're into American classical music at all. He 1900 to 1990, I believe, are his dates. I won't go into his bio too much. He's a New Yorker, Brooklynite, son of, I think, Russian Jewish immigrants. Took an obligatory few years in Paris to study with Nadia Boulanger, who pretty much every American composer of his generation seemed to do that. But what he's most known for really is kind of creating this kind of the quintessential American orchestral sound, even classical music sound. If you're going to sound American, you basically have two choices. One is to incorporate lots of popular elements like jazz and rock and things like that. Your other option is to sound like Copland, and you definitely get that when people are being very self-consciously American with their music. So you hear that in some of Jennifer Higdon's orchestral pieces, which are inspired by like national parks and things like that, but also in film scores. Saving Private Ryan has a very Copland-y sound to it. Dances with Wolves. Even a movie like Hoosiers about basketball in Indiana in the 1950s definitely has a Copland-esque kind of feel to it. And that's despite the fact that it uses like synthesizers and things like that. It still gets that kind of Copland-ish touch. So I thought I'd talk about like what exactly is a Copland-y sound, and how might we hear it in Appalachian Spring. So Appalachian Spring, Copland writes in 1944 for Martha Graham's dance company. And it really, if he wasn't famous before, he's definitely famous after this. It wins him a Pulitzer Prize in 1945 as well. And so how does Copland kind of evoke the sort of frontier spirit of this ballet? So one of his big techniques, the fancy name for it, is called pandiatonicism, where you're using essentially all the notes of the major scale, which isn't that weird. Lots of music uses all the notes of the major scale. But what's different is that it doesn't use them in sort of the conventional chords. So you sometimes get as many as 6 or 7 of these notes of the scale all at once, kind of stacked on top of each other. And that's actually one of the first things you hear in Appalachian Spring. And it's the effect of that is that when you're using the diatonic collection, this is a very familiar collection. It's a very pretty one. It doesn't sort of offend people's ears. But once you take it out of this kind of context of what you might call chord progressions, which is for centuries the way people would have used these notes of the major scale, suddenly it gives it a great kind of stillness. The music doesn't feel like it's kind of going somewhere in any kind of hurry. And when people describe Copland's compositional sound, that's a word that they use a lot, is that it has a great stillness to it. Even when there's actually some kind of rhythmic activity happening, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's kind of charging towards a goal. And I often compare it to sort of riding on a train, either a slow one or a fast one or a smooth one or a bumpy one. Even though there's motion happening, even though there's some sense of going forward, you're also kind of sitting still at the same time. And so, as I say, even when you're getting kind of rhythmic activity, there's a sense of being really grounded too. So let's hear some of that stuff in action. I won't go too much into the plot of Appalachian Spring. Martha Graham, a lot of her choreography is very iconic, as you can already see from this first image. This kind of frontier house building thing is just a few very small props without a lot of extra filler going on. So she kind of prefers to distill things to their essence when she's kind of working with these images. And in that sense, this kind of stillness in Copland's music works very well for it. As I say, you can hear all of these sort of lines and kind of repeating figures just sort of stacking on top of each other. They don't seem especially goal-directed necessarily. There's kind of a layer. There's Martha Graham. Things are about to get a little bit more energetic and dancey here, but even as we get this sort of high energy, rhythmic, very vital music, you can still, there's a lot of unison passages, so it's not getting especially sort of intricate in that way where you have a bunch of different things happening at once. And even when you do get several different things happening at once, they tend to happen in these sort of repeated chunks where you can, your ear gets a few tries to get used to them. And again, it's sort of like being on a train where you get this sort of chugging along sense rather than this sense of a million things are being thrown at you all at the same time and you're constantly being thrown in different directions. Again, even as the music is very rhythmic and jumpy. So you can hear that repeated accompaniment. Great. I'll go on to the next one, just so we want to hear the end. And of course, if you're going to do things like evoke a certain country or countryside, you can do, again, the sort of Grainger technique of incorporating folk materials. And Appalachian Spring has probably the most famous folk song quotation ever made. It's maybe not a folk song. We think we might know who the author is, but it's the Shaker hymn of "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where you ought to be. And, it's such a kind of popular song now that it's sort of hard to imagine that it wasn't when Copland used it. I think, as far as we know, it would have been a relatively unknown song when Copland brought it into this Appalachian Spring ballet. But once he did, it took off, and now it seems like one that virtually everyone knows in some way or another. But it's a big centerpiece of the end of this ballet and of the sort of concert version of it, where he sort of repeats the melody, calls them variations. So you hear it in a few different versions. And so I will listen to just how this shaker melody appears and the ballet events that happen along with it. As you can tell, Martha Graham definitely favored, as I say, iconic and just kind of simple, sort of getting to the essence of things. That's even true in the names of her characters. This guy is the husband, and that's the bride, and we have the preacher as well. So they don't have actual names, they're just sort of archetypes. I'm going to stop it there. We'll skip ahead to the last part where this melody comes in as it goes into the final section of the piece. The final section, you'll see them praying. It's actually marked like a prayer when it happens. This is the passage where the simple gifts actually stops playing, where it happens for the final time and moves into the new music, is the prayer section. Even the instrumentation gives it a sense of kind of spaciousness and openness. It's only 13 instruments, string instruments, piano, flute, bassoon, clarinets. Here's the prayer passage, as you can probably see. there's something oddly appropriate about seeing it in black and white. This is, of course, I don't know exactly when this video was made, but it's obviously an older one from near when the piece was written. And yeah, again, it gives a kind of iconic quality to it. It's like they're sitting for a painting or something. Cool. Yeah, I see those character names there, right? Yeah, lovely stuff. Well, in any case, I do hope you watch the stream. As I say, you can find it through the GF Symphony website. And if there are several apps you can use to get it, but of course you can just go to the link directly and watch it in your browser. Sunday at 2. And I hope you'll see it. As I say, we've already made the recording, so I already know how it's going to go, which is not usually the case when I'm doing these previews. But anyway, hoping you all enjoy it when you see it. So thanks, everyone. Till next time.